Welcome to Tagat, Namhla.
Thank you for having me, Tigray.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I think most of my viewers will not know you. I will hazard a guess. And you are a professor at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. And your research interest is in state formation and statehood and effect of colonialism on state formation. And you focus on Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa more generally, maybe, and you have written some papers on that topic. And the way I came across you, Namhla, was a case of the internet's rabbit hole, maybe leading me to some interesting places sometimes. And I read your article and I thought this is something who's doing really meaningful research, who is trying to answer some of the basic questions in Ethiopian political discourse. And that was why I wanted to invite you on here for you to share your views on Ethiopia to my viewers. So I'm really happy that we have managed to come today. But before we delve into Ethiopian matters, tell us a little bit more than I said about you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, yeah, like you said, I cover Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa widely, and I call myself a political historian because I'm interested in trying to make sense of contemporary politics in Ethiopia and the region because they are so fascinating, they're so complex. And what I discovered is that they just make so much more sense if we go back to the past, if we look at history. History provides us with some clues, maybe not the whole answers in full, but they give us some clues into why things are the way they are today in Ethiopia and the region. And yeah, I was drawn to Ethiopia because I also come from a country that sees itself as quite exceptional on the continent. I'm from South Africa. So Ethiopia and South Africa share this similarity of exceptionalism. So, but I was drawn to Ethiopia for different reasons because of the history. I thought the history was so rich and so interesting, and so I wanted to really understand this country, how it came about, what is the history behind what we see today in Ethiopia, and by extension, in doing that preliminary work and research on Ethiopia when I started. Realized that you can't just study Ethiopia, you have to go beyond in the region because Ethiopia is so intimately linked with all the other countries in the region. Ethiopia is so central to politics in that region, and so by extension, the interest extended to the rest of the region. But the main focus has remained Ethiopia because I saw that in trying to understand current politics, looking at how the state came to be, looking at the history of how the state came to be. And so that process made me, question what is happening in the neighborhood in general. Yeah, so I'm interested in state formation, in particular how the nation state came to Ethiopia and how it came to the region.
One thing that caught my attention in one of your papers was what you said about exceptionalism, I suppose, where you describe how it doesn't come naturally for many Ethiopians to identify themselves as Africans. So for Ethiopians, or at least maybe for the vast majority, there is Africans and then there is Ethiopians as distinct from Africans. And I think that is one way in which the sense of exceptionalism is reflected, I suppose. Am I right in saying that?
Correct. Yes, absolutely.
And also, you say that state formation in Ethiopia, as in other African countries, has been heavily influenced by colonialism. And I was struck by that because it runs counter to the conventional wisdom in Ethiopia. Because one of the conventional wisdom in Ethiopia, as you have written about, that Ethiopia is one of the two countries that has never been colonized, and the conclusion people draw from that is that Ethiopia is pure. So there is no influence of colonialism in anything to do with Ethiopia, whether it is state formation or any other aspect of life. So I want you to tell us, in what way has colonialism influenced state formation in Ethiopia?
I would say that I put it this way, that in my view, I think that Ethiopia is both a product and beneficiary of colonial modernity, or the presence of colonialism in Africa and that region in particular. So how is it a product? And when I say it's a product of colonial modernity, I mean to understand the history of the modern Ethiopian state. So for me, the modern Ethiopian state really came to be in the late 19th century, and that was after Adwa. That's where we can trace the beginning of the modern Ethiopian state. And so that period, it's been written about, what a pivotal moment that was. What happens after is why I say Ethiopia is a product of colonial modernity. That defeat at Adwa led to Ethiopian state formation, in the sense it brought the Western understandings of statehood right at the doorstep of Ethiopia. So the definition of territorial borders, the colonial agreements that were signed between Ethiopia and later Italy, but with France, with Britain. So that process, those processes lead me to believe that those were the foundations of Ethiopia's implications or associations with colonial modernity. And the idea of Ethiopian sovereignty came to be. Out of those processes, Ethiopia became a sovereign state. It received recognition internationally. So it doesn't get more modern than that. It embraced these features of modernity, which were largely European at that time. So it became a recognized modern state, and so that's where it started. And I argue that from that moment on, then Ethiopia started to behave like a nation state. Whether it was ready to become a nation state or not, it was forced to act like one, because now, there was this expectation, especially from the international society or community, that this is how nation states look like, and this is how they behave. And for me, my understanding of that is the European version, which was brought to Ethiopia and elsewhere later on, is that there has to be this harmony between the state and a nation. And so Ethiopia had to find that harmony between a state and a nation. And so that process began. And the tensions between that kind of have continued up until today. So in that sense, I think Ethiopia was a product of colonial modernity. And it was also a beneficiary because it was able to use these elements or features of statehood to really kind of drive its own internal processes of state making, the imperial government, the imperial state at first. And so the imperial state used some of these, its sovereignty, it used it, and it tried to gain legitimacy inside, and it was not afraid to use violence to establish that legitimacy. And because it was under pressure to form a nation in order to continue to exist as a nation state. So yeah, that's what makes me say that Ethiopia did not escape colonialism. It might not have been direct colonialism and occupation, or settler colonialism, as in, say, South Africa, for example, but there was a direct interaction between Ethiopia and these ideas of colonial modernity.
So this whole notion of colonial modernity, maybe you'll expand on it a little bit later, wasn't an unmitigated disaster. It has its own benefits and its own problems, of course. But one of the unsettled debates in Ethiopia, as you will know, is what is the essence of Ethiopia? Is Ethiopia a state? Is Ethiopia a nation? Is Ethiopia a nation state? These are really, really contested debates in Ethiopia. But maybe for the avoidance of any doubt, so that everybody is following through the discussion, you could tell us what are these terms? In what way are they different in nation state, and then we will go to the other issues around that.
A state. So a state is a very basic concept that refers to an entity, a political entity that regulates society. It manages society, and it is territorially defined usually, and it usually presides over a group of people. And its role is to regulate interactions and what happens, and is to provide security within the defined borders that it's within the demarcated borders. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that I would call a state. Let's not mistake it for a government. A government is something completely different. A government runs the state. A state is permanent. A government is temporary. So a state hardly changes. Once it is established, it remains. Governments come and go, and they preside over a state. A nation refers to people. It refers to a group of people that are usually found within a state, but they don't have to be within a state. A group of people that have some shared features, communal, such as language or religion, history, culture. And previously, the state and nation, they were completely different ideas, really. Many societies have states. A state is not a uniquely European idea. Societies around the world have had states of one form or the other. So it's not a really, specifically European concept. Neither is a nation. But I guess terminology then, it might have different origins. But what's important in our conversation, I guess, would be how a nation state comes about. And for me, that is the crux of it. Because what we have currently in Ethiopia and in Africa are nation states that are struggling to function, that have been struggling since independence in the rest of the continent, and clearly in Ethiopia as well. So the nation state itself is a very specific idea. Now, a nation state has specifically European origins, and it's an idea that comes out of 15th century Europe, out of processes specific in that region. So it's a very uniquely European idea that comes out of Europe at a very specific historical time as well. 15th century, fast forward to the 19th century, Europe goes through a lot of upheavals, but the nation state emerges as the fundamental idea of political community in Europe. And then in the 19th century, we have, of course, the scramble for Africa begins, and European nations now have already established their nation states. They're already established, and out of, again, internal processes within Europe, they seek to expand for social and economic reasons. They seek to expand to the rest of the world. And we know that history, and so they come to Africa, colonization begins, etc. But what we find in Africa is colonies. We don't have nation states. And for the entire colonial period, there are no nation states in Africa. We have colonies, British colonies, French colonies, Italian colonies, etc. Fast forward to the 20th century, the mid-20th century, and colonialism comes to an end, and European colonial powers retreat, and they leave the African continent. And once they leave the continent, that is when nation states come to Africa. So that's when the nation state is born on the African continent at the end of colonialism. So when the colonial powers leave, they give independence, political independence to African countries, and they become nation states. They are told that they are nation states. They don't have much of a choice in the matter. They are told that they are nation states. They are accepted, and they are welcomed into the international system, which is composed of nation states. And subsequent to that, it's really an unmitigated disaster for the African continent, because there is no harmony between the state and the nation. It's a major struggle to achieve this harmony because of a number of reasons, but of course, mostly because of what happened during the colonial period. how people were categorized, how people were divided, whether it was under direct rule or indirect rule, but most of the colonial powers practiced indirect rule. So largely because of idea of colonial governance, of indirect rule, it becomes very difficult to establish and to maintain nation states in post-colonial Africa.
Fascinating. And my sense is that in the aftermath of the end of colonialism, one of the things that happened in Ethiopia was the emperor, was the ruler then, was also under the impression that Ethiopia should become a nation state, which was why he felt compelled to abrogate the confederation with Eritrea. And Eritrea was made to be part of Ethiopia. And the understanding then was that Ethiopia was one big nation state. And it was that notion that led Eritreans to push for independence, which they eventually achieved in 1991, which is why there are a lot of, as they will call them in Ethiopia, secessionist movements from various nations within Ethiopia. So are you then saying that that is one effect of colonial modernity, or am I stretching it a bit?
The Eritrean case in particular. Yeah. I think you would be accurate to say that it is a product of colonial modernity as well, that friction between Ethiopia and Eritrea and the events that unfolded up to Eritrean independence. It was precisely because of the role that Italy came to play in that territory. That enabled Eritrea to claim a separate colonial identity and subsequently its independence. Because when Italy colonized Eritrea, there were boundary demarcations. Everyone knew where the Italian colony begins and where it ends. So there was no ambiguity about that. So that was one part of the story, that it was clearly demarcated territory. And the Italians exercised authority within that territory. So there was clear, colonial governance for this territory. And the people inside the colonized within that territory, it was also clear to know who they are. They were easy to identify. It was not difficult to determine who they are. So in that sense, then we would say that the story between Ethiopia and Eritrea it's an example of how colonial modernity impacted the region and impacted Ethiopia. Because it was clear when Eritrea wanted its independence, it was based on specifically that period of Italian colonization. And they were able to justify it successfully, so that we were an Italian colony, and no one could dispute that. The records were there. Everybody knew it. And so they could successfully claim separate identity from Ethiopia. And, the rest is history. So yes, I think we would be able to argue that that history between Ethiopia and Eritrea is also a consequence of colonial modernity.
Well, you say the rest is history, but of course, as you know, many Ethiopians would disagree now, because one of the hot pursuits in Ethiopia now is Eritrean ports, and what people say to justify even illegal, forceful annexation of the ports is that it was illegal for Eritrea to have seceded in 1991, and that it was time now for Ethiopia to make that historical correction. That is what people say. I don't know where it fits in your analysis in terms of the colonialism and its effect and all that, but at least a significant number of political forces in Ethiopia would say that it was a historical mistake and that we should correct it. That is what they would say. And when they say that, my understanding is that they are making appeal to some notion of a fanciful nation state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They are actually, yeah. I mean, I think they would be justified to want a port and all of that. But their claims, I don't think their claims have any legal basis. I think if they were to appeal, for example, at an international court, I don't think they have a strong case. I think this was what happened in 1993 was kind of received the endorsement of the international community. Um, so I think the claims that are being made today are conditioned by the fact that Ethiopia doesn't have a port, and other political reasons.
So the argument, maybe it's a silly argument, but the argument the Prime Minister of Ethiopia repeatedly makes in this respect is that Ethiopia is a country of 120 million people, and that you can't have 120 million people suffocated, whereas tiny countries around it have ports, and that alone justifies Ethiopia's quest for port access. I don't know where it stands in terms of international law, but that is the serious argument that they have in
Yeah.
Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah, I was going
yes.
to ask you more broadly in terms of the tug of war between the center and the periphery. Also because you try to explain why the Tigray war happened, and in your understanding, there are two philosophical viewpoints at war here. On the one hand, you have the forces who want to centralize everything, and these are forces who have been inspired by the colonial modernity idea. And then you have other forces, like the forces in Tigray, who want more autonomy, who say that Ethiopia is not a nation state, that Tigray is a nation, if not a state, and that by that fact, Tigray is entitled to more autonomy. Is that a fair way of characterizing the fight between Tigray and Ethiopia, for instance?
Okay, I'll start with the Prime Minister's assertions on the port. The Prime Minister is 100% justified to regret the fact that Ethiopia, the second largest populous country in sub-Saharan Africa, without a port, it's unthinkable. Quite honestly, he's quite right. It's unthinkable, and it's regrettable, and it's unfortunate. It makes very little economic sense, and of course for security reasons, etc., etc. But the Prime Minister has every right to regret that decision, and the government has every right to pursue avenues to rectify that, because it's not sustainable really for a country like Ethiopia to find itself in such a position. But the question is, how do you go about doing that? How do you rectify that? You've got these different neighbors that have a coast. Several neighbors with a coast. Eritrea is not the only one. So there's something with Eritrea. That's why I'm saying I don't think it's just about the port, the ongoing rhetoric in reference to Eritrea. It's about something else, other political issues and tensions between the Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the port, yes, it has to be resolved somehow, but I don't think annexing any port is going to be a justifiable solution. In terms of Tigray, the tough one. In my view, all of the forces in Ethiopia, at least since the mid-70s, at the start when there was this proliferation of ethnic nationalism, that's when the TPLF was born, that's when the OLF and others were established, like the major ethnic nationalist formations in Ethiopia. I see those formations as, they're not trying to do something different. They're not trying to get away from the idea of the nation state. They are playing to it. The nation state, the idea of the nation state, the dominance of the nation state in our politics in Africa, has led us down various cycles of conflict, recurring conflicts. Similar case in Ethiopia. And I think it's in that paper that you might be referring to, where I tried to make sense of the recurring civil wars in Ethiopia, these repeated cycles of political violence. And what I find is that the common denominator is really that at the heart of it, is contestations for power, political power. No one wants to do away with the nation state. Everyone wants to find a way, to capture state power and to establish the nation state with their own nation. So everyone wants to be that nation that captures the state for political power. So when they started, these movements began, and so that's why it's ethnic nationalism. It's not just, ethnic movements, or it's ethnic. There's a very nationalist sentiment, a strong nationalist sentiment. And that nationalist sentiment tells us that this is about political power. So I don't think there is going to be a radical, departure from how political power is currently organized. And if I may talk about the centralization versus federalism. So currently is like Ethiopia is in limbo. We don't know which way things are going to go. And I want to argue that in 2018, we all saw 2018 this transition happening, and a lot of people had high hopes and that things are going to change. And there was the assumption that they're going to change for the better. That was where the mistake was. But I think for me, 2018 was a missed opportunity for a more genuine transformation of Ethiopian politics. Federalism as it was that was where it really kind of came to an end, really, where this experiment came to a halting stop. That was the opportunity to take stock of why has it failed. And a lot of people like to refer to the fact that it was ethnic federalism. That's why it failed. This ethnic element to it. Yes and no. The ethnic element has to be considered. But federalism itself, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing problematic about federalism. Decentralizing power, having regions self-govern to a certain degree. But if you say that regions or provinces are going to self-govern, then you must do that. Let them self-govern. So the issue was not ethnic federalism. It was how this was done. It was how it was done. I mean, in South Africa, we've got provinces, for example, 9 provinces. And these are not ethnic provinces, but there is an alignment between these provinces and the people in those provinces in terms of ethnicity. They're not called ethnic provinces. They're called provinces, and they they self-govern to a certain extent. They've got certain powers and they've worked. They do what they're supposed to do because there is that from the center. But I think that this is what was lacking in Ethiopia, that genuine decentralization of power was in theory, largely in theory. In practice, for all those years, we saw from 1991 up until 2018, we saw how there was a real struggle in terms of devolving powers. The central federal government struggled to genuinely devolve powers to the regions. So I don't think ethnic federalism is a problem itself, but how it was implemented. Now, calling for centralization, trying to reverse what was a federal system, I think it's lazy. I think it's a shortcut, and I don't think it's going to solve the fundamental questions, the fundamental issues, which are about how do we formulate a nation to go with this Ethiopian state? What is an Ethiopian nation? Who is an Ethiopian nation? Who belongs to this nation? Why? Who doesn't? Why? So I think fundamental questions have to be asked about how to constitute the nation in Ethiopia.
So to really emphasize this point, because it strikes me as a very important point in relation to Ethiopia, because people have different analysis as to why Ethiopian federalism failed. And the fashionable thing to say now is that it failed because it had an ethnic element. But you're saying that the reason it failed was because power wasn't decentralized in the way that the constitution said. So the constitution or the arrangement was federal on paper, but it wasn't in practice. And the reason why federalism works in South Africa is not because it doesn't have ethnic element, because as you said, it has, although not in name, but because power is truly decentralized. Is that a fair summary of the point? But I think this is a really relevant point, because one of the again, I'm mentioning a lot of unsettled issues in Ethiopia, and one of the unsettled issues in Ethiopia, really contested issues, is why did the federalism fail? And many people say that it was always bound to fail as long as it had ethnic element. And of course, there are some people like you who say that the reason it failed was because it wasn't truly federal.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that is a fair summary of what I'm saying, what you said. Yes, definitely. I think ethnic federalism was introduced. Of course, now we know that it was another attempt to salvage the nation state. When, those who captured state power in 1991, the coalition, the EPRDF, they did not want to collapse the state. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. It was decided, and to establish this federal system, to try and keep everyone together, still to keep the thing, the broader structure of the Ethiopian state intact. So federalism was implemented, and so the ethnic element for me is really, it's the by. Maybe because I'm speaking from a non-Ethiopian perspective, but my contention is that what I see is that Ethiopians have not really had the difficult conversations around ethnicity and ethnic differences. I don't. Maybe I've missed something in the literature or in my research, but I haven't really come across evidence to suggest that Ethiopia has quite reckoned with what ethnicity means in Ethiopia. And I think it's, of course, a result, again, of there was no colonialism. Ethnicity is not really an issue for us. Ethiopia, everyone speak the same language. So because of that background of a largely centralized state, where the nation was defined in very specific ways, has resulted in this kind of blocking of alternative identities, really, when it comes to the nation. And that is where I locate the source of the conflict, of the violence, really. So there really hasn't been a clear understanding of what ethnicity means in the Ethiopian context. So that's why people they shy away from these conversations. Maybe they are difficult conversations, yes, but I think they need to be had. They absolutely need to be had going forward.
You also say that 2018 was a missed opportunity, because what you think should have happened was for Ethiopians to take stock of what had happened and why things failed, and to set Ethiopia on a fundamentally different trajectory. And of course, that didn't happen, and that was the reason why the things that subsequently happened, not least the Tigray genocide war, happened. I say genocide, I'm not putting words into you. That's my description. And also, now you're telling me that Ethiopians should have difficult and uncomfortable, maybe, and maybe painful as well, conversations about ethnicity and what their implications are. And also maybe drawing from the example of South Africa, Namhla, what do you think are the conversations that Ethiopians should have then, more concretely?
Yeah, it's interesting, because in South Africa, it's not that we've had these conversations. We also shy away from conversations about race. In our case, it's race, less ethnicity. So we haven't been successful either in having those conversations, but we have made attempts. I don't know if Ethiopia had something similar to a truth commission. Did Ethiopia have a truth commission?
No,
Not yet.
no.
Because I know there have been plans for such.
They talk about reconciliation and national dialogue and all that, but it's more propaganda than anything that has to do with reality. No, it has never been had.
Yeah. So definitely something along those lines needs to be had, but it has to be a genuine attempt. It can't be superficial. It can't be owned by any particular political party, for example. It has to be a very objective process as far as possible. Yeah, there has to be some kind of conversation. Like we had in South Africa, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there were hearings about, killings, abductions, imprisonment of black that process was not perfect. It was highly flawed, but it went some way into kind of preparing us really for democracy, for this new dispensation that was going to begin in South Africa. It was an acknowledgement that, and it was not about blaming perpetrators. It was also for survivors, for victims to come forward and to tell their stories and to look the perpetrators in the face and, yeah, it's difficult conversations, but something along those lines is needed in Ethiopia. And for people who have done wrong to acknowledge it, it's very, very difficult. But I don't see a way out if those kind of conversations are not had, because if people don't have the conversations, it's very difficult to move forward, and to move forward in a positive and productive way, because you're still stuck in the past. You still have these feelings and of animosity, and the blaming of each other continues, and it manifests itself in violent conflict. So other than that dialogue, that kind of a commission of, a reconciliation commission, whatever they want to call it, I think it would really go a long way as a starting point to a national conversation.
We have about 20 minutes, Namhla, and if we could zoom out of Ethiopia and have you reflect more broadly on things in Africa that a lot of people talk about. So one of the things that people mention often is the reason conflict recurs recurs of what you mentioned, the effect of colonialism. So, for instance, borders were drawn arbitrarily rather than following some natural patterns. And I think that is a problem that at least intellectually people have understood in Africa. So there is no more discussion that needs to be had about that. I think people understand that that is a source of a lot of problems, and to the extent that it's possible, it is something that people should address. But it seems to me that you are making a more fundamental point in terms of the notion that all the assumptions of organizing society, of running government, of state are also imported from the West. And that is the reason why they are ill-fitting to African societies. And that is something that Africans should reflect on and seek alternative ways of organizing society. If that is what you're saying, can you then, maybe I'm putting you on the spot here and it's not fair, but can you then suggest what the alternative ways of organizing society should be?
You are putting me on the spot. It's a tough one, honestly. But yes, I think you're summarizing my argument quite well. Whether it's Ethiopia or it's Nigeria or it's Tanzania or Somalia, the issues are so similar. The issues are very similar, and there is this constant struggle with finding that harmony between the state and a nation, not the nation, a nation. We have these multiple nations within one country, and all of them, they want state power. It's a recurring theme across the continent. And all of these different nationalities, whether, however they fashion themselves as ethnic nationalities, they want state power because they know what it means to have state power, the power that comes with it. You get to determine the direction where the country is going, to make final decisions about so many things, about your country and society at large. No one has really wanted to break away from that, except for the few, and they happen to be in the Horn of Africa. Even them, they broke away to become nation states. South Sudan, Eritrea, Somaliland is struggling to find statehood. It is a nation that is existing without a state. So there is no entity that has decided to go outside of this system that wants to exist, because this is what the international system looks like, and we are bound to that international system whether we like it or not. And if any entity decides to do things radically and to break away and to exist without recognition, without all these features of the nation state, it won't make it. They simply won't make it. But with my argument is that we have to at least think about alternatives. I mean, I think what we're currently seeing today, the international system is, it's being transformed right in front of our eyes. The global power shifts that we are witnessing. It's really tough, and we don't know what the end is going to look like. What kind of system we're going to have once the dust has settled, so to speak. So I think we can start having a conversation as a continent. What do we want our societies to look like? What do we desire? And for me, I am one of those people who the conversations about democracy, for me, they come second, third, fourth. They come so further down the line. Like you said, I'm interested in the basics, how societies are structured, the fundamental foundations of our societies, and the nation state is that foundation. So how do we think differently about this foundation so that it works for us? Because as Africans, our societies are so unique. They're so diverse. The level of diversity we have on this continent is unparalleled. And so it's just unthinkable that we would force this system, this nation state system that has Europe as its center, and try to make it work in our context. It's just unbelievable. So I really just want to have conversations about alternatives, what works for our context, what alternatives, what they might look like, just to think about it. Just to think about it. We might not be able to implement anything. Use Mamdani quite a lot in that article that you referred to on civil wars in Ethiopia, in his latest book, where he's calling for the decolonization of the political. And for him, that means really this untangling of the nation from the state. For him, that's where it should begin to start really having better outcomes, especially in Africa, in terms of how our societies look like.
Well, I'm happy that you said we need a conversation about the basic assumptions as a continent. And, maybe I'm somebody who has been influenced by the Western media, but the impression I get from where I'm sitting is that Africa in general is in a perpetual state of conflict and wars in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Somalia, in Sudan. The easy conclusion to draw from that is that the international system or the status quo wasn't designed with Africa in mind. And that might be one of the reasons why Africa is in the state of affairs it is in. And maybe the solution is for Africans to get together and to interrogate the basic system, the basic international system. And I'm happy to hear you say that. The problems we mentioned in Ethiopia, for instance, you also studied the case of the Somalis and the Ogaden. We haven't had time to go there. Maybe if you'd like to reflect on that for a little while, I would be happy to hear. But more broadly, in terms of your own research, Namhla, I want to ask you how you find researching about Ethiopia. I study computer science, so I don't have any expertise or anything in these areas. But my sense would be that Ethiopia should be the researcher's dreamland because of the many, many social problems that need to be studied. But I would like to hear your reflections on your journey in relation to your research on Ethiopia and maybe interactions you have had in Ethiopia, how they perceive you, because Ethiopians tend to see a foreigner with a certain lens.
Yeah. My experience has been quite rich researching Ethiopia. I think my journey began 2009, around 2008, 9. Yeah, that was my first trip to Ethiopia. Without revealing my age, but that was the first time I traveled to Ethiopia.
Oh, Ethiopians are obsessed with age, so don't give them any hint about that.
So that's when the initial interest began. I saw this wonderful country. It was so different from anything that I'm familiar with. And still I could relate at the same time. And I think that's really the essence of my experience in Ethiopia, how I would define it. I feel like I'm not quite an outsider, but I'm not an insider either. So it's just been very interesting. I am able to relate. There's some things, I mean, I don't know if you've traveled on the continent much, but my experience traveling on the continent, that wherever I go, I might be anywhere, I always feel a connection. It's still Africa. It's Africa. There's certain things that connect us, and these are not, tangible things. It's not language. It's not how we look. It's just something. And in South Africa, we call it Ubuntu, which means humanity. So that thing, it's always there for me wherever I travel on the continent. I don't feel it anywhere else outside of the continent. And so I was able to feel that in Ethiopia. But at the same time, then you have these huge differences, is the country. First of all, it's, there's a lot of people, it's busy. It's the history, it's so different, this long rich history. So yeah, I'm able to relate, but at the same time I just cannot relate. So it's this contradiction. So it was very heartwarming, actually, when I initially, then subsequently I went for actual research for my PhD subsequent to my initial visit. And now I was on my own, but before I went with a company that I was working for, a research company I was working for, but now I was just by myself the second time, as a researcher, as a PhD student. And I was pleasantly surprised with the generous welcome that I received, institutional settings, especially. People were keen to talk because they were curious about me. I think they were curious about me. So I received people that were willing to assist, to open doors for me, to refer me to other people, and all of that. And I wouldn't say that I received any resistance, honestly, but I think it's just been my own feelings of imposter syndrome, really, especially if I'm in a setting with Ethiopians. I feel very like, it's so difficult to explain, but I wouldn't say I've received, people have really rejected me. It's just my own feelings of inadequacy and imposter syndrome that I've felt, especially in academic settings with other Ethiopians. But this is usually balanced out by the generosity that I've received as well. Yeah, it's
Well, I read a comforting article somewhere that said that if you don't feel imposter syndrome, you're not hanging out in the right environments. So that's a good thing that you feel that, and also it means that you have an awareness of yourself. So that's positive, I think. Thank you very much, Namhla. I have learned a lot, and reading your papers was so educational for me. And I hope it's going to be the same experience for my listeners as well. I'm going to add links to the papers on the description box. But from my side, that was that. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It was lovely to be here.